Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump traveled to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates on the first major foreign trip of his second term. Accompanying him were dozens of American business leaders, including the CEOs of major tech firms like Amazon, xAI, NVIDIA, IBM, Palantir, and OpenAI. During the trip, US and Gulf companies announced multiple high-profile deals in artificial intelligence and advanced technologies, together worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Those deals, collectively, signal a new phase in US-Gulf relations, moving beyond traditional security and energy ties to cultivate cooperation in tech and AI development. To discuss these issues and where they may lead, we're joined today by MEI Senior Fellow Mohammed Soliman. An engineer by training, Mohammed is a business advisor at McLarty Associates, a non-resident senior fellow with the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and a visiting fellow with Third Way. His research interests include national security, energy, and regional strategy, as well as the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and business in the Middle East.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Rethinking Democracy with Ganul Toll and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis. But now let's get to our conversation with Mohammed Soliman. Mohammed, we couldn't think of a better guest to talk to about today's topic, so welcome back to Middle East Focus.
Thank you for having me again, guys. Has been a long time.
Let's lay the groundwork for the rest of our conversation with a really basic question. How do the Gulf states, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, view tech, and in particular AI, and how does it fit into their longer-term economic development strategies?
I would say that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the entire Gulf are looking into AI not only as a sector, but as a foundation for who they are in the 21st century. More than oil-producing countries, they want to integrate AI within the broader economic activities of their economies, making sure that there's huge growth or major growth in their own non-energy sectors, but also how to benefit from the advantages that they have right now, which is capital, energy infrastructure, to situate their own economies as a major node in the AI ecosystem that's emerging in a global scale. And what I mean by that is, how can you transform the energy infrastructure and the capital into a compute power? And compute is the capacity for a nation at large to process large language models, deploy it, training it, and making sure you are somehow a back end for AI as a service for the rest of emerging markets. So this is basically sums how the Gulf thinking about AI when it comes to their own DNA in the 21st century.
And what role do advanced tech and AI play in this evolving US-Gulf relationship?
Traditionally, if you asked me this question 10 years ago, I would say the relationship is energy for security framework, right? This is where the core of the relationship, this is how the relationship is started. And right now, I would say it's changing. It's heading into a place where the relationship is going to be based on compute, not crude, where the Gulf is able to offer what I said, the compute capacity for American AI hyperscalers to able to use this massive surplus of AI infrastructure in the region to train our data, to house our data, to use it for AI deployment. And I cannot overemphasize this enough. When people are thinking about the question of AI, there's a fixation on chips as the main bottleneck for AI. I disagree with that. I think the main bottleneck for AI at large is the question of energy. Energy consumption for AI ecosystem is really massive. And right now we have a compute supply problem. You have a lot of demand, but you don't really have enough capacity to service that. So this is why we're looking into the Gulf to fill that sort of need that we have at the moment.
We've seen a lot of increasing issues with that energy bottleneck here in the U.S., in Northern Virginia locally, among other places I know. Mohammed, turning to last week's trip, what were your kind of key takeaways from President's trips to the Gulf? Beyond the massive headline investment figures, what were the most important tech deals announced?
So there are two things that were announced last year that I want people to pay extra attention to. One is the US-UAE AI cluster that was announced. Its measure is massive. 5 gigawatt, up to 5 gigawatt cluster. This could consume about 2.5 million NVIDIA chips. To put this into perspective, it's the largest AI cluster outside of the United States. The French cluster is 1.2 gigawatt. To give you an idea, inside the United States, the collective capacity of the Stargate project is about 4.8 gigawatt and not in one place. So it's really massive, it's really huge in scale. And of course, it's going to start with 1 gigawatt capacity first, up to 5 giga afterwards. It's a huge testament to the way the US is thinking about the UAE as an AI player, not as an upcoming, as a current AI player, that they trust that the energy infrastructure, that the talent, that the security arrangement exists for us to do that major investment, major AI partnership with the UAE. The second announcement that I also found to be very interesting and extremely important is Saudi Arabia launching the AI company Humane. It's a PIF subsidiary that's going to be the holding company in the kingdom when it comes to AI infrastructure, data centers, and they secured a major deal with NVIDIA to build up their infrastructure for the company. And also they had the AWS Amazon announcement for AI zone in the kingdom. So I'll say these are the two deals that I feel are inflection point for the relationship. Like the very idea that those two deals were front and center, got the most coverage, it meant that the relationship has shifted already from the idea of traditional energy deal or arms deal. And on top of all of that is also a testament that those two countries are capable and very well situated to be that sort of back end for our own AI ecosystem globally as we're entering this phase of tech competition with China.
Taking a look a little bit more closely at those two deals, especially for a non-technical audience listening in, how would you kind of assess their importance and how much do they do to kind of move the ball forward for Saudi Arabia, the UAE, in terms of their own goals and objectives on AI?
To put this into a perspective, as of today, inside the United States, we consume 4% of our own electricity grid for data centers. For us to maintain that level of AI development, AI deployment, by 2030, we will direct 9% of our own energy grid, electricity grid towards data centers. So this is really massive, really huge. So when we're thinking about gigawatts of data centers, we're thinking about electricity that are required for cities, double the size of Washington, D.C., almost the size of Seattle. And that gives you an idea that energy is going to be the decisive factor for us to unlock the potential benefits of AI and able to deploy AI at scale. That's basically the question we're facing. And the very idea that Saudi, UAE, and the rest of the Gulf were able to build that sort of infrastructure around energy. Because again, it's not the question of how many barrels of oil you have. It's the question of, do you have the electricity grid, which is really massive? Do you have the electricity stations able to transform all these energy output into input into these data centers is the question. It's a testament that they have the infrastructure. It's a testament that the ecosystem is very developed, that they're able to house that. And also data centers are not really brick and mortar. It's a lot of things that goes into the data centers. It's chemicals, it's cooling systems, either immersion cooling or directed chip. It's who are the kind of engineers and talents you have. It's also the integration that you have the cloud system around that. So it's really high end when it comes to the AI value chain. And this is a huge inflection point, not only for the relationship between the United States and the Gulf, but also in the Gulf positioning outside of the US-China AI ecospace and positioning them as, I would say, the third theater in AI between us and the Chinese.
So just to clarify, are you saying that they have this necessary capacity within their energy sector today, or just that they have plans and realistic roadmap forward to have it in place by the time these data centers are built?
Today, they do have the capacity.
Today they do.
And it's a compute triangle, right? It is the question of energy, it's the question of data centers, and the question of accessing ships. Mm-hmm. And I think, and on top of that, of course, do you have the regulations to go through red tapes and build this massive build-up in no time? Do you have the capital investment for these data centers? And we're speaking about billions and billions of dollars. I would say when you look into all the factors, clearly we do have the requirements to be this massive, this big nod in AI.
How significant a departure are these AI and tech deals that were signed last week or announced last week from the Biden era export control policies, which were aimed at preventing China from getting access to the most advanced AI chips?
In the last week of President Biden's tenure in the White House, his administration released the AI diffusion rule. And the AI diffusion rule is a framework that classifies the word into three tiers: tier one, tier two, tier three. I'm going to spend few seconds on that. Tier one, those are the most trusted American partners, Five Eyes, many countries in NATO, not all of NATO, the countries that are extremely important to the AI ecosystem: Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. And then you have tier two, and this is very much the rest of the world, like Southeast Asia, the entire Gulf, India, Israel, half of Europe, from Poland, Hungary, to Turkey, and the rest of the world. And then you have tier three, and those kind of are the competitors, the adversaries. We're speaking about China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran, those four countries and others. So this is pretty much the rule that the Biden administration released before they left the White House. And the philosophy behind it is compute should be restricted. Compute is a techno-industrial capacity that we should restrict in terms of who should have this sort of capacity in the broader global AI ecosystem. So let's restrict it. Let's make sure that we are only doing compute inside the United States. That was the argument. You can imagine the sort of responses that many partners, allies had as a sort of framework in terms of what number of ships that can have what percentage, and what about our own development plans, what our own trusted relationship. And then it became also a problem for the broader American tech community, because when you're thinking about American champions, right, NVIDIA would have lost $15 billion in exports that they are no longer able to export under the AI diffusion rule. It became an inflection point on the way people are thinking about the question of export control of ships. So you do have the school of thought, the first camp that released the AI diffusion rule that say we have to restrict. And there's another camp that's saying pretty much what I have been talking about, which is the actual bottleneck is energy, not really ships. And don't assume the export control alone going to maintain American leadership in AI, because don't assume the export control alone will keep that sort of gap between us and the Chinese. That really not how it works. And it's better us today, in a moment of leadership, in a moment of superiority when it comes to ships, to able to link some regions to our own AI ecosystem. So how about we move to a bilateral agreement on AI when we address all our security concerns about end user verification, tracking our ships, making sure that they're not diverted, and making sure that this ecosystem is part of our own broader AI ecosystem in the United States. I would say pretty much the AI deal with UAE and the agreement with Saudi Arabia are in the second camp. The administration already officially presented the AI diffusion rule. Now they're moving more towards a bilateral agreement on AI that's basically make sure that we lump this together within the broader trade and investment and security arrangement of the relationship, rather than like a broader global rule that comes with a lot of complexity.
Back in February, you had an article in National Interest where you wrote, the Trump administration has embraced AI as a strategic pillar of its national economic security agenda, rejecting the regulatory caution of previous administrations in favor of an aggressive pro-growth, pro-competition strategy. The Trump administration is not merely aiming for leadership in AI, it is seeking outright dominance, positioning Washington as the global gatekeeper of AI capabilities. And I wonder if you could address how critical is the relationship with the Gulf for America's ability to meet this goal?
Excellent question. When I wrote this piece, I believe that was after Vice President Vance's speech in Paris in the AI Action Plan. And when you go through his speech, it was a paradigm shift in the way we're talking about AI. I think it's very fair to say in the past 5-6 years, AI safety was the cornerstone of how we're thinking about it, just all about safety. And I think his speech was mostly about AI action. And he said, I come to you today to speak about AI as opportunity, AI action. And in his thinking and the administration thinking, AI is here to enable American leadership, that we need to think about AI as a strategic asset, that we need to make sure that were dominating that space. And there is the domestic part of it, and there's the international part of it. The domestic part of it is, you have seen when the administrator of the APA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was nominated, he talked about cutting red tapes for data centers, that we want to make sure that we are able to give all the right incentives for American companies to build the massive data center infrastructure that we need, make sure that we have the energy for this, also for this major infrastructure buildup. And you have seen the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, and the Stargate project that was somehow got the presidential blessing by President Trump. So clearly that was a major priority for the administration on the domestic level, cutting through red tapes, making sure that we have the incentive structure for these data centers to flourish, that we are able to increase the numbers of data centers inside the United States. And on top of all of that, of course, continue the push for localization of chip manufacturing inside the United States. Of course, we have the CHIPS Act giving the right subsidies for companies like TSMC to build fabs inside the United States. So this is the domestic side of the story. On the international side of the story, and this is where the Gulf comes in, is if we agree that energy is the main bottleneck, if we agree that the Chinese are racing to be in parity with us, and I have been reading white papers on the Huawei Ascend AI chip, and it's fascinating. The 910C chip is almost 80% parity with NVIDIA 100. That means pretty much what we used to assume about China lagging behind may not really be that correct, meaning we're still in a leadership position, but the gap is not as wide as we have imagined. So if you are thinking that way, the energy is a bottleneck. If you also understand that Chinese are catching up, not only in quality, but also quantity, this is a country that's able to outproduce anyone else, even if they don't have their niche yet. But think about how they dominated the electrical vehicle space, right? I would say 6 years ago, if you look into the way the Chinese are able to innovate on the EV battery level, also the number of units they're able to produce electrical vehicles. If you think about this model and apply it to the way they're thinking about semiconductors today, I think you're going to have an interesting picture in the next 3 to 4 years. So with all these factors, you want to make sure as the United States to link with your ecosystem another emerging ecosystem that has what you don't have. The energy buildup, the capital, that the centralized decision mechanism to make sure that AI is their own priority. So they're able to do this massive buildup in shorter periods of time. And you're really linked on the national security level. You have American persons there, and they can act as a back end, not only for you as the United States, but also a back end for other regions that we may, as the United States, do not have compute power for. So if we don't have compute power enough for our own AI deployment and application inside the United States, maybe we can reach that point, but we clearly don't have compute for Africa, for South Asia, for even some parts in Southern Europe, in Latin America. So you're always looking for close allies and partners who have that capacity to work with us. And this is where the Gulf is in this sort of sweet spot, the right time, the right capabilities, and also the right national security imperative.
So looking forward, where do you see the administration's export control policy going? Do you think we'll see more of these sort of bilateral deals and a sort of broader opening up of the quote unquote middle tier, previously referred to as middle tier countries?
Reflecting on how this president thinks about international relations, and he thinks about international relations and success in terms of how many billions of dollars he's able to unlock for American businesses. And also considering that he has been pivoting away to more of bilateral agreements on all sorts of things, right? Trade agreement with China, we have seen the phase 1 trade agreement back in his first term. Now we have another negotiations going on with China. We have seen this Saudi deal, the UAE deal. He is someone, and this administration by extension thinking on, is going to pursue bilateral agreements on AI. That's going to be the new norm. So the UAE-US AI partnership is going to be the model, to be honest, that's going to be replicated with other countries. And I think you might see an agreement with India. India even though they're not former ally, but clearly close to the United States. And we have been seeing the relationship very well developed. So you might see another agreement with India that follows the same pathway as the agreement with UAE. Brazil shouldn't be discounted as well, also in Latin America. So those are the two countries that come to mind. And yes, to answer your question directly, is going to be bilateral agreement framework on AI. That's going to be the new model forward.
Let's talk a bit about some of the risks or stumbling blocks that might be in the way to fulfill the highly ambitious objectives of these US Gulf tech deals. Several issues immediately come to mind, and I thought we could take them one by one. First could be supply constraints. Reportedly, NVIDIA and AMD have reached agreements to supply hundreds of thousands of chips to Saudi and Emirati tech companies or to locally based US centers, including 100,000 to the UAE's G42 company alone over the next 2 years. You've already kind of laid out that these are, in fact, large numbers, especially compared to what is in place currently. So speaking of production capacities, how much is available now? What's planned for the near future? Will there be enough of these advanced chips to go around, or are these coming at someone else's expense?
It's a very tough question. I don't think that the problems that we have inside the United States are mainly about accessing ships. I think ships exist. And again, I think the main problem that we have is that the infrastructure around ships are not here at a certain scale that we need for the actual training inference of data. This is the biggest problem. And if you agree with that premise, therefore you come to this sort of view that think about ships as iPhone, right? It's going to be diffused no matter what. And also considering that China is making major development on the question of ship development / production and how this coming to parity with our own ships, I'm a bit skeptical about the idea that when partners import ships for their own buildup, let alone a buildup that's going to be co-developed together and in partnership with the United States, is somehow diversion of use of ships. The only difference is, instead of using those ships here, because we don't have this massive data center buildup, we're basically using the data centers being built there for our own training and inference that we might need. That's my broader take on the issue. But I'll be frank with you, that's a major issue that's being discussed right now, because it's a major inflection point, because we do not really see this major AI cluster before. So clearly there are questions that are being raised that are worth exploring.
The second often cited concern is the potential for the diversion of advanced US chips and AI technology from the Gulf countries to China. But there also could be the risk for Chinese commercial competitors to access the computational power of US AI infrastructure in the Gulf for their own purposes. The White House has asserted that the deals do take these national security concerns fully on board. But from what we know based on the announcements or the released memorandums of understanding, do you think that these concerns have been properly addressed?
Let's examine the two concerns. One, when we had the AI diffusion rule and even the current agreement, there is something that we call the end user verification. So you verify who is using the compute. So it's not really like an abstract compute power that anyone can access. There's a licensing around who is using that compute, and this is where you have the end user verification. And again, if the AI partners from our side are AWS and Google's and Microsoft's, that makes it easier on the question of who's accessing your compute, because it's servicing a broader ecosystem. The second one is the diversion of ships. And I don't think that was the main concern for the Gulf, because also when people think about ships, people think that these ships are like diamond or watches that are very small. You can take 200 in your briefcase. That's not really the case. The latest NVIDIA chip, it's like a 8-foot stack that has almost like 72 GPUs. Is really massive. Like those are really massive units for this sort of data center buildup. So the idea of diversion, and given that geotagging these sort of servers are becoming a new thing, a normal thing, and you on top of that you have end user verification, and American companies are operating it. I feel the idea of diverting stacks or ships to China coming from the Gulf, I don't think it's the main concern. I also think it's already addressed given the G42 Microsoft agreement that we have seen last year, given the way that I heard David Sachs, the AI czar, speaking about those sort of agreements. I feel that this was a major concern that they have discussed. But the gulf in the broader US-China competition was not seen through the ship leakage to China. I think other regions like Southeast Asia always comes to mind in terms of diversion. I think it was the end user verification was usually the biggest concern. And I think given the end user verification license, I think that also is addressed as I talked about.
And in terms of long-term regional security questions, the Middle East, remains beset by various conflicts and state-to-state tensions. Last year, amidst the Houthis' campaign against international shipping, we did see that several undersea internet fiber optic cables were cut in the Red Sea. You said earlier that the Gulf's geostrategic location was an important selling point for locating AI infrastructure there. But doesn't it kind of all depend on the security situation in the region improving and becoming more predictable?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question about that. The security landscape is going to have a say over all of these developments. And as someone who used to live in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, absolutely, the Houthi threats have been impactful on development plans on the Red Sea coast. And I would argue the same thing when it comes to this building AI cluster. You need a much more stable, a much more prosperous region. I would say that UAE and Saudi Arabia did a good job isolating themselves in the past few years from these sort of major security concerns when it comes to development projects, the major infrastructure buildup that they're doing for the AI ecosystem. But needless to say, you need resolutions to some of these security concerns. And this explains to me why they have been more welcoming and more supportive for a peaceful negotiations between Iran and the United States, because no one really wants a war between the United States and Iran that will have a huge impact on all of these projects, on all of these ambitions, on all of these long-term diversification plans. You cannot defy the rules of gravity, even if you're the best and smartest and have the best capabilities. At the end of the day, you are part of the region. So no, I take the concerns you laid out seriously, and I think we are taking these concerns seriously in terms of the way forward.
So certainly making the case for a closer coordination between economic diplomacy with regional de-escalatory diplomacy, I would imagine.
I think they're interlinked. I think right now we're speaking about economic diversification, positioning yourself as a node for the global AI ecosystem, making sure your relationship with the United States are very tailored for the 21st century. All of these issues will require coordination, making sure that it's interest-based relationship, making sure that we're putting the material aspect of the relationship into consideration, especially when it comes to AI and compute infrastructure.
Looking a little bit longer term, kind of down the line, do you think there's a risk that by exporting these kind of cutting edge chips and building up these AI and data centers abroad, does the US run the risk of offshoring a core strategic industry?
So I'm on the opposite side of this argument, and I heard this argument from colleagues and friends. If you accept my premise that China is not that far behind us, and you accept the premise that they're already reaching close to parity on the quality of ships, at least as what we know from publicly available sources, then you have to accept the premise our leadership should not be taken for granted, right? And we do not have the scale. We have a scale problem when it comes to China. We cannot outproduce the Chinese. It's vice versa. China is outscaling us, outproducing us. They have the fundamentals of a techno-industrial economy that's able to produce things at scale. That's very clear from the electrical vehicles, the way the number of exports that they have is very clear to me. So if you accept that premise, you cannot really think about the question of ships today or and let alone in the next 2 years, as this is a restricted asset that is going to be a niche club of nations having access to. I don't buy the argument. So does the Gulf benefit from a partnership with the United States because that will make their trajectory faster in terms of going up on the ladder of AI development? Absolutely. Are they getting the best chips today? There's no question about that. There's clear difference between the NVIDIA H100 or B200 with the Chinese in comparison with the Chinese chip Ascend AI for sure. But this is not guaranteed. And if you are the Gulf and you're already, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, if they're putting AI front and center their economic diversification plans, and they're putting that massive capital, and they have the energy infrastructure, and they already have a major data center buildup, they might go to the other way. They might go to China. It's going to be a longer process, a longer journey. It's not going to be easier. But will they go there? Will they become the global back end for AI? Yes. It's going to take time. It's going to take longer time, but they're going to get there because they have the fundamentals of compute. They have the location, they have the capital, they have the political leadership. And I think the question is back to us. For us to outscale China, we need partnerships with countries that we believe are able to give value or scale up our own capacity. And it's basically few countries, a few regions around the world that give us that sort of advantage. EU could be Gulf, India, Brazil, Indonesia. I mean, you have few countries that have this sort of ecosystem that we need to partner with. We just happen to have a region that's very much aligned with us on the security level that allowed the conversation around tech to go to the next level around chips and building massive cluster of AI in the Gulf. This is why they're getting the first wave of heat. But the idea of offshoring, I don't buy it. Like the idea that compute is only American asset, I don't buy this argument.
Looking down the road a little bit further, if all of this pans out as advertised, if all of these deals are realized to the terms that they've been laid out, what does that mean for the Gulf in 10 or 20 years' time in terms of its economy, its tech landscape, its position in the world, and its relations with the US?
If all these deals manifested and everything went according to plan and those ambitions become reality, you might see the Gulf acting as a region that offers compute as a service for the rest of emerging markets. Think about the Gulf as a place that house large language models in Swahili, in Hindi, in these languages. And they are able to offer housing data, training data, inference for all these economies because they have the infrastructure. So they're going to become the AI leader for the emerging markets. And this is a tremendous, tremendous level of influence, tremendous level of development of where they used to as energy producers to become a back end for AI applications. This is really, really massive. It has its own challenges, but I think this is the trend line of where the Gulf might go if everything went according to plan.
What would it mean kind of at home for their own societies?
We don't really have a clear idea about what this massive deployment of AI means for us as humans. And this is not really a question about the Gulf. It's about the United States, right? You have seen all these announcements from American companies saying we're going to be AI first. So make sure you integrate AI. We're seeing layoffs when it comes to software engineers. So the question of what AI mean for the rest of the world and for us, it's very difficult to answer. And I would argue maybe in the case of the Gulf, they have a different dimension that maybe doesn't exist here, which is for quite some time, the length of the way we're thinking about the Gulf has been mainly through security, through oil production. And for us to change that length towards emerging technologies and AI, there's a culture aspect of it, right? I mean, that those people were able to do giant leap when it comes to critical technologies, that they're becoming a partner of a choice on AI, and take such a huge transformation of the bilateral relationship, let alone the broader perception of what the Gulf is and what the Gulf is today. And I think this is pretty positive on the cultural level.
I think you probably agree that, especially in the Gulf, this is very much government and elite driven. But is there anything that can be said about how these issues are being wrestled with within the broader conversation, happening in these societies in the Gulf?
I would add a caveat here. I think, of course, the political leadership are the main driver for this major, massive buildup of AI clusters. There's no question about that. But this is also coming with a wave of empowerment for the middle class, for entrepreneurs, for women in the workforce. And that has a clear impact on the broader societal dynamics in terms of how globalized these societies are becoming. When you go to Dubai and Doha and Riyadh, It's no longer the perception that Dubai is the exception. It's actually, this is becoming the norm, that you have very globalized Gulf societies. Second, you have a very, very technologically native societies for real, because you need the human talent for this major buildup. And then it will pose a lot of questions about what does it mean to be an Arab in the 21st century in a region that's fully developed and technologically important in the global AI conversation. I think those are going to be the sort of questions that will have to be answered. And pay attention to the cultural products, pay attention to movies, pay attention to all these shows coming out of the Gulf, because I think those are indication how the Gulf youth grappling with these sort of questions. I think they are very deep questions because the change is very rapid. It's generational. It's happening within the same generation. Someone who lived in Saudi, the social transformation that you have seen was unprecedented in no time. I think it's going to be profound social transformation.
It's a really fascinating point, I think. Is there anything that you saw during your time there, any sort of manifestations of this in pop culture or anything like that you can point to?
The type of novels that you go see in the bookstore is different. Sci-fi is a new emerging trend. The type of ambitions that you see when it comes to the middle class in Saudi Arabia is also different. Meaning, whenever you go talk to a young grad in Riyadh, the first thing he or she tells you is, I want to build an AI lab. And this is a very interesting thing to say, especially at this age. So yeah, it does have an impact on the social ambitions, on what people consume, on what people think about, that you have this entire middle class that's in their mind. If I'm going to go into work in the private sector, first of all, I want to have my own company. And this company is going to be an AI native company, is going to be an AI lab. That's a growing trend that I see right now.
It's a fascinating point. We've covered a lot of ground here, but we're running short on time, Mohammed. Big picture outlook, where do you see things going from here with the tech landscape, with the US Gulf relationship? What's your kind of forward-looking projection?
Compute, not crude, is going to be the central pillar of the US Gulf relationship moving forward. It's no longer going to be only about energy policy. It's going to be about compute and how we and the Gulf are building an AI ecosystem that's able to service third markets, emerging markets. And this is a huge inflection point for the relationship where we were a few years ago. And moving forward, the relationship is going to be much more impactful on technical questions around AI, data centers, ships than before.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode. You can find MEI's latest coverage of tech and AI, US Gulf relations, and other regional issues on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI as well as all of Mohammed Soliman's work on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you will listen in again next week.